You did the hard part. You went no contact. You built a new routine, a new life, and maybe even a new relationship. On paper, you look free. And then, out of nowhere, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, grief shows up anyway. Not for the chaos, not for the person who hurt you, but for something you can't quite name, and it makes you feel like you're failing at your own healing. That's not a weakness, that's a survival loop, still running a search for something that was never actually there. I'm Angela Darling, and today I want to talk about one of the most confusing parts after leaving a narcissist. The grief that shows up long after the relationship is over, even after you're certain that you made the right choice. Because if you're still asking, why do I miss them? You're asking the wrong question. The real question is, what am I actually grieving if it was never really them? See, this is what actually happened in that relationship. Somewhere early in the relationship, there was a version of them that felt like everything you wanted. They were attentive, they were warm, and you felt like you'd finally chosen somebody who saw you clearly. That version was real enough to hook into your nervous system, but it was never the relationship you were actually living. It was the preview. And the rest of the relationship became an ongoing campaign to get that preview back. Think about what that does over time. You stop grieving a person and you start grieving the possibility. The version of them you kept hoping would return, the apology that never fully landed, and the relationship you were promised in the beginning and kept being told was still coming if you just tried a little harder, forgave a little faster, and asked for a little bit less. So now, months or years out, when that grief hits, it's not longing for who they actually were. It's mourning for who you needed them to be. And the fact that you finally have to accept that they were going to be that. And that's why grief can feel so disorientating. You're not sad about the fights or the silent treatment or the way that you had to shrink yourself to keep the peace. You're sad about the ending of hope. And hope doesn't end all at once. It ends in waves, usually right when you've stopped expecting it to. Maybe you've seen a couple laughing together in the coffee shop and feel a pang that has nothing to do with the actual person you left. You'll hear a song from early in the relationship and you'll feel your chest tighten, not because you want them back, but because you're grieving the version of yourself who still believed that it could work. And here's the part that makes it so hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived this. Even people who love you will say to you, but you're better off now. Why are you sad? And they're right. You are better off now. That's not the contradiction it feels like. You can be certain that you absolutely made the right choice and still grieved what you hoped that relationship would become. Both things can be true at once. And this is where it gets even harder to untangle, because the grief doesn't just show up for the relationship. It shows up for time, for the years you spent trying to fix something that was never yours to fix, for the version of you who kept believing that this time it will be different, long after the evidence said otherwise. That grief isn't about them at all. It's about you and what staying cost you. And here's what I really need you to hear, because it's the whole point of this video. You're not missing them. You're missing the ending that you never got. The apology that they actually meant, the version of them who finally saw what they'd done to you, or the relationship that matched what you were promised on the day you were promised it. That ending doesn't exist. It was never going to exist. And grieving this isn't a setback. It's the last honest thing your hope has to do before it can finally rest. And that's the real shift. It's not that you loved the wrong person. It's that you loved a possibility. And possibilities don't get closure. They just get grieved in pieces whenever your life happens to remind you of them. And this shows up in ways that catch survivors completely off guard. You'll feel fine for months and then spiral for a day over something really small and assume that this means that you're not really healed. And you'll wonder if missing anything about the relationship means that parts of you want them back. You'll feel guilty for grieving someone who treated you so badly, as grief is only allowed for people who deserved you. And here's what almost nobody tells you. This isn't a sign that you're not over them. Being over somebody was never actually the goal. The goal was letting the hope finish grieving so it stops ambushing you on those ordinary days. And hope doesn't finish on a schedule. It finishes when you stop needing it to have a happy ending. That's a completely different kind of grief than missing an ex. You can't rush it by reminding yourself of every bad memory. You can't logic your way past it by listing all the reasons that you're better off. Your body isn't grieving the facts. It's grieving the story you were promised. And it needs the space to actually finish telling itself that that story is over. So if you've ever felt ashamed of missing somebody who hurt you, I need you to hear this. This isn't a flaw in your healing. That's a nervous system finally allowed to feel what it never got to feel while it was too busy surviving. For a long time, there wasn't room for grief. You were managing, adapting, walking on eggshells, holding the relationship together with both hands. Grief needs safety to show up, and you didn't have any. Now that you do, it's arriving, but it's arriving honestly. One day, that pang in the coffee shop will just be a pang and not a crisis. One day you will hear that old song and just feel nothing but distance. One day you'll realize that you're not grieving them anymore. You're just remembering the way you remember any closed chapter in your life. You didn't fail to get over it. You're finally safe enough to grieve it properly instead of just surviving it. And this is exactly the kind of pattern that the sacred coding method exists to work with, because closure was never actually about something somebody else could give you. It was something that your own nervous system had to arrive at once it finally felt safe enough to stop bracing and start feeling. You can tell yourself you're over it as many times as you want. If hope never got to finish the grieving, it will keep showing up uninvited, no matter how much distance or time you put between yourself and what actually happened. Breaking the survival loop here isn't about forcing the grief to end faster. It's about letting it move through you now that it's finally safe enough to, instead of bracing against it like it's still a threat. That's how it actually resolves, not by force, but by finally being allowed for it to happen. If you're tired of grief ambushing you on days you thought you had healed, I've linked my free masterclass below, and I'll walk you through exactly why grief after narcissistic abuse doesn't follow a normal timeline, and how survivors will finally get to the other side of it. And in the next video, I want to talk about something almost every survivor eventually has to face. And that's why people around you, friends, family, even other survivors sometimes get impatient with how long your healing is taking, because their timeline was never built for what you actually went through. And once you understand that difference, you'll start asking, why am I not just over this yet? And you'll start asking the question that actually protects your healing. Whose timeline am I even trying to meet? Until next time, be gentle with yourself. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not missing them. You're just finally safe enough to grieve what you hoped they'd be, and that grief will finish in its own time.